Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mark study number 8. Mark study number 8. We will be in Mark, the second chapter, verse 23 through Mark 3, verse 6. So it's two episodes from the life of Jesus that refer to the Sabbath day. And that's a very important discussion in the Gospel of Mark, and we'll cover that in some detail in this study today. To prepare us to properly understand the Gospel of Mark, it would be very important for us to try to get into the mind and into the culture and the history of first century Palestine. It's never really a good idea to study a passage isolated from its history, from its culture, and the times in which these were lived. And among Jews of the day, of the first century, it was important to remember that these folks saw life in black and white. It was a binary way of thinking. Everything was either clean or unclean, either good or bad, pure or impure. And it's so important to understand that that was ingrained in their thinking, so much so that in the first century, if you were a Jew and you went to the home of a Gentile, you could find numerous ways of becoming ritually impure. You might touch someone who has touched blood or eaten blood. You may touch someone who hasn't been careful about avoiding dead bodies, which would make you ceremonially unclean as well. And there were a host of rules, ritual hand washings, and finally, Sabbath observances, good and bad, black and white, pure, impure, clean, unclean. Everything in a Jew's life was about that. And so as we go through this passage today, it's really important to understand how important Sabbath observance was to the ancient Jews. In fact, so important was it that they missed the point of the law. They had missed what was the most important things about being a God follower. They had missed simply because they had taken on this idea of clean and unclean, pure and impure, so completely seriously that it was difficult to function. You saw things, you avoided people, you avoided things, but you avoided people too as a result of that, like touching a leper or touching a dead body, or demons, demon possessions, the ritual washing of hands, the careful observance of the Sabbath day, crucially important to the Jews of Jesus' day, and help us understand what happened in this passage. Now, there are two episodes in today's reading in Mark that reflect the depth of wisdom in Jesus' teaching and Christ's emphasis on human need versus ritual impurities, ritual cleanness or uncleanness. Interestingly, we've already been introduced to this subject in the Gospel of Mark in indirect ways, such as the first mighty miracle of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is the casting out of an unclean spirit from a man who was worshiping at the synagogue. A very interesting story. Jesus was not criticized for doing this on the Sabbath day, but it was clear that that would have been thought of. And the people were amazed at his power, but it didn't take long for them to not just be amazed at his power, but now to be annoyed, worse, to be sinful and ritually impure, to do certain things on Sabbath day, because Sabbath was a day of complete rest. God's laws, as you're going to find out, were not ever meant to be oppressive to people. They were meant to be protective of people. They were meant to be freeing. The way that the scribes and the Pharisees, the experts of the law, had done the law of Moses in these days was to make the law enslaving, to make the law impossible to keep. And that's always in mind here as we go through this passage. Mark 2, verse 23, and then I'll read on through verse 28. One Sabbath, he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath day?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Now here's what happened. It's Sabbath day and they are walking through grain fields. It is possible that some Jews in that day, being the Sabbath, would have been critical of their walking anywhere at any time on the Sabbath day. In fact, there had come to be known a Sabbath day journey, which was a short trip on foot. And it may be that they're not only eating on the Sabbath day, harvesting on the Sabbath day with their hands, but they are they're breaking the law of Moses here, according to the scribes and the Pharisees, by eating and drinking and eating and then walking as well, and then plucking ripe grain from the stalks of wheat, rubbing them in their hands to husk them, to get the husks off, and then to eat them. I can't help but think, just a quick aside here, that would not have been very tasty, not as light as popcorn, but it might have a certain nutty flavor to it to eat raw wheat or whatever, or barley, whatever the grain was. I would think you'd have to be awfully hungry to eat raw grain. Yet they were so busy with ministry that they had not eaten, and they were walking through the grain field, and they would pluck these heads and then rub them in their hands and eat them. The legal purists, the Pharisees, are lurking nearby to watch for any misstep that Jesus and his disciples might make. So when they saw them eating the raw heads of grain, they pounce. They're breaking the law of Moses. They're doing something that is not lawful for them to do. Jesus defends his apostles and then goes deeper. He tells them the story of how David and his men were hungry once and how they ate the holy bread that was in the tabernacle, the holy showbread. The story is from 1 Samuel chapter 21, and you can read it at your own leisure. It's an interesting story on a number of levels. But David, who was the man who was anointed to succeed King Saul, was on the run from King Saul. King Saul was, I think, quickly losing his mind and may have even been tormented by evil spirits. But Saul was, who once was the friend of David, David, who was once his personal aide and in every way friend, had become his enemy. He'd become paranoid of David. The crowds came back and sung the praises of David, that he'd killed 10,000 while Saul had only killed thousands. So there was a great bit of jealousy and envy on the part of Saul. So Saul went out after David to kill him. And David had a small group of soldiers with him as they were on the run. Now, imagine for a moment a whole army of people is looking for one guy and a small group of men. You would be on the run a lot. And Saul was certainly out to kill David. Well, David was needing to eat. They were famished. And so when they stopped at the table at the tabernacle, which was located in a place called Nob, where we're not really sure where that is. But anyway, it was located at Nob. David and his men went and they said, "Is there anything to eat here? Do you have any bread?" And the high priest said, "We have the holy bread that the priests eat." And he gave that holy bread to David. and his followers because they were hungry. Technically, legalistically, the high priest broke the law of Moses here. The showbread was to be given only to the priests, but the chief priest had in this case given it to David. And Jesus cites this story and says, this is why it's more important to show mercy than it is to legalistically follow the law. We're going to help someone who is famished, and as opposed to say, no, you can't have this even though you're really hungry. We're not going to let you have it. So the apostles were hungry like David's men. It would be permissible to allow them to pluck grain and eat it on the Sabbath because they were hungry. But the Pharisees say, no, they're harvesting and they're not supposed to be reaping. There's another interesting parallel here between David's story and the story of Jesus that we just read about. David would eventually become king. He was the anointed one who would assume the throne of Israel and become the greatest and most heroic of Israel's kings. The Messiah would be referred to, the Savior of the world would be referred to as the son of David or the offspring of David. And here is Jesus, the one who is the fulfillment of prophecy, with his disciples, hungry, technically, legalistically breaking the law, but Jesus, who is our great high priest, defends them and says, is it wrong to do this? David did it. The high priest did it out of mercy, broke the law out of mercy for David and his men. And then Jesus declares, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the boss of the Sabbath. He's the sovereign. He's in charge. A claim to divinity, a claim to being God. So what was Jesus teaching here? He was convicting the legalists of wrong thinking about the law. And I think this is important for us because we can have wrong thinking about our rules and regulations that we have inferred and interpreted from Scripture as well. And we need to be careful that we don't do this too. The Pharisees, number one, had made the law an oppressor of men and women. The law had become oppressive. You couldn't do anything on the Sabbath that even resembled work in the first century. And there was quite a bit of rabbinical controversy about the things you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath day. But it had become such a heated issue that several books were written on the subject, how to properly observe the Sabbath day, when it's simply stated in the Ten Commandments, just keep the Sabbath day holy and rest on that day and don't do any actual labor. But the Pharisees were so fixated on the prohibition of work that they extended the law to cover anything that even remotely looked like work. You could only travel a certain distance. You could carry only very light weights for very short distances. You couldn't pick raw grain and eat it. That would be considered harvesting. And so the law had become oppressive and not freeing. Secondly, the Pharisees had made the law into the end, not the means to an end. The Sabbath law was established to enforce mindfulness and thanksgiving and rest on the people of God. God knows that we need rest. God also knows that we need to pause to rest long enough to think about how we are blessed, to think about our relationship with God. They were to do nothing so that they can enjoy the day and think about all the good that God has done for them and to praise God for that. It was a time for worship and praise and friendship and renewed fellowship with those who would attend the synagogue with them. And they could study the law together. Sabbath gave them a legitimate opportunity to nourish their faith and nourish their friendships. But the Pharisees had made the law the end. They had said, no, you just got to keep the rules because you got to keep the rules. That's what God wants. God says it, so we're going to enforce it. Instead of saying the Sabbath had a purpose, and it was a good purpose, and that God had good commands, and that he had every good intention of blessing us with Sabbath, not beating us over the head with rules and regulations about the Sabbath. Thirdly, The Pharisees had elevated ritualistic purity over human need. The Pharisees had elevated keeping these rules and regulations above the human need to show mercy on that day. In other words, on the Sabbath day, the Pharisees didn't want you doing any good for anybody. In fact, there were rules and regulations that physicians were not allowed to heal on the Sabbath day. They were allowed to keep you from getting worse, but they were not allowed to restore or to heal someone on the Sabbath day, which would have been part of the reason for this criticism of Jesus, is that on the Sabbath you're not supposed to make anybody better. You're not supposed to make anyone who is hungry not hungry by picking grain off stalks of wheat. And so this means that the ultra observance, I'll call it, the ultra observance of Sabbath rest became so binding that they were not allowed to act out of mercy in an emergency on the Sabbath day. It does seem ridiculous, and yet it can happen to us. We lose our sight of what's going on when God gave us Sabbath. It was an act of mercy to us to have Sabbath. He said, I didn't make man for Sabbath. In other words, I didn't give this rule so man would have to jump through all these hoops. He said, I gave Sabbath to man as a gift. Friendship, worship, praise, joy, rest. The one day of the week they would have rest would be on the Sabbath day. And it seems the Pharisees completely missed it. And of course, underlying all of this is their absolute opposition to Jesus Christ. Their opposition, their jealousy. It's not mentioned yet in the text, but it certainly is a problem as you see it begin to emerge in these early chapters of Mark. And the Sabbath discussion is not complete yet. We have one more episode we're going to share with you from Mark chapter 3 and the first 6 verses. So let me read those to you. Again, he, Jesus, entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus. In other words, they gazed at him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And from that moment forward in the Gospel of Mark, the official Judaism is aligned itself now to plot to kill Jesus Christ. The opposition to Jesus has now come to him from those who should have known better. We expect unclean spirits, demons, and Satan to oppose him, because that's what we've seen in the first 2 chapters of Mark. The work of the enemy has already been on clear display here. You've got leprosy, you've got demon possession, you've got illness, you've got paralysis. You've got the enemy working through powerful Jewish leadership, through legalists who believed in the law of Moses, but who horribly misapplied it. Now the enemy is among the Jewish people. And a man with a withered hand may have been the victim of a serious stroke. Here's a man who has not been able to use his hand, at least one of his hands, for perhaps a long, long time. Calling it withered, it was dead, basically, is the indication. Perhaps you've seen folks who have the contraction of a hand after a stroke, where they cannot open their hand. In fact, I've seen hands that were so withered, so what we would call contracted, that he was unable to unclench. This person was unable to unclench their hand. And sometimes you will jam a wash rag in there, in the hand, to try to get the fingers out of the palm of the hand. And I've seen it go on for so long that the fingernails would literally grow into the hand. So this withered hand was not a small deal. This was a very painful thing. And I've seen people try to open these contracted hands. They call it contractures. And it's very, very painful, and people don't like to have their hands open once they have contracted like that. So here's a man with a withered hand, and the Pharisees are on the lookout. They're watching, see what Jesus does with this. They get the absurdity of this for a moment. Jesus of Nazareth, a mighty worker of miracles, inexplicable power. And these guys are not concerned at all about this mighty act of God that's about to take place, but are doing nothing more than watching for him to make a mistake that they can criticize, that they can bring a charge against him. Because it seems there's no illness, there's no satanic oppression, there's no disease, no fever, no leprosy, no contractures of the hands that could stand in the way of Jesus' great restorative and healing power. They're watching for a miracle on the Sabbath day, but not to marvel at God's greatness and goodness, but are looking at him, waiting for him to make a mistake. It's absurd. They only see what they want to see. If he heals this guy's hand on the Sabbath day, we're going to have something to say about that. We're going to have a charge against him because he's working on the Sabbath day. And Jesus heals the man's withered hand, but he doesn't do it secretly. He could have taken the man aside and just done it secretly. He actually, here are these guys that are just privately prying eyes, watching him. He brings the man out to them, has the man stretch forth his hand, and immediately the man's hand is healed. And then he turns to these seething Jewish leaders who have found what they want to find. And he asks them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good things or to do harm? Is it wrong to do a good thing on Sabbath day? Is it lawful to save a life on the Sabbath or kill somebody? Which is it? They would say, well, it's just as wrong to do good on the Sabbath day as it is to do a horrible evil on the Sabbath day. That's how distorted their thinking was. There was no thing good you could do on the Sabbath day because you were doing something. That's how crazy their interpretation of the law had become. And when Jesus asked that question, well, which is it? They couldn't answer, because if they answered anyway, it would sound ridiculous. There was no answer. And they would have had to say, well, it's a sin to do good on the Sabbath, and it's a sin to do bad on the Sabbath, and one's just as bad as the other. It's unlawful to save a life on the Sabbath. That's ridiculous. They know it, but he has caught them in their own logic. And what they contend makes no sense at all. You can't do good just because it's the seventh day. Jesus can't perform a miracle out of mercy because it's the seventh day. They say nothing and they get mad. In fact, he gets angry and then immediately says, but he was grieved in his heart. That's the other flip side of anger, is always grief. His anger sprung from the sorrow over their hard words, over their distorted thinking, the hardness of their hearts. Whenever you hear the word hardness of heart, it's a resistance to learning. Hardness of heart is a resistance to learning. It's a refusal to learn anything new or to admit that you were wrong. And these guys were not going to do that in front of him or anyone else. And this, right in front of all the folks who were offended by his Sabbath doings, he has this man stretch out his hand and heals him. Instead of being wowed by this moment, they are angry and they go out immediately to plot to kill him. And don't miss this either. And we're getting close to the end. These Pharisees went out and plotted with the Herodians against Jesus. Now, unless you know who the Herodians are, you wouldn't appreciate that. They were going to figure out how they were going to kill him. If you don't know who the Herodians are, then you won't understand exactly what's going on here. The Pharisees were staunch critics of Roman rule. They did not support revolution, but the Pharisees did not like the idea of Roman boot being on the neck of Jewish people. They looked at Romans as occupiers. that their land was occupied. Theirs was the promised land, and that Romans were unlawfully there. They were unclean pagan people who did unclean things, worshiped foreign gods. They had conquered the Jewish people. They were occupiers. They were not friends. And Herodians were the very essence of what might be called the swamp today. These are the career politicians. These are the devious, violent, paranoid folks who are related to Herod, to that string of governors named Herod. This is the party of the ruling Herods. This is the party of the status quo and Roman rule. The rulers over the Jews, of the same family of the man who killed the baby boys in Bethlehem. The Pharisees hated these people, but they consorted with them in order to plot Jesus' death. It's unbelievable. It's different people from completely different political stands, and they're plotting together to kill Jesus. The right and the left plotted to kill Jesus. The Jews and the Gentiles killed Jesus. Let me ask a question. Was it right for the Pharisees to conspire with the unrighteous to kill a righteous man? Well, of course not. Yet there were so many blinded by their own lack of spiritual insight, their lack of humility, that they couldn't see what they themselves were doing. Now, one of the things that most concerns me about Christians is that we can take on the character of Pharisees over matters which are peripheral to the gospel story. We get exercised about whether certain theological positions of certain Christian groups are right or not, and we fail to see the fruit of the Spirit born in those people's lives and ministries. We just see the mistakes they make in certain matters, and we become judges with evil thoughts. They're wrong about certain positions, so we don't see any of the good that they do. Let me ask this, which is better, to uphold correct positions on theological matters or to practice mercy and care? I hope you don't hesitate to answer that correctly. Of course, it would be wonderful to have our theological positions all lined up with God's and then be people full of mercy and care. But since we are human, that is impossible to do perfectly. Was Sabbath observance as important as doing a good thing for somebody on the Sabbath? I have known some of our elders absenting themselves from Sunday morning services because there's someone in need at their home or they're in the hospital. They tend to matters of mercy, and they set us a wonderful example. That was Jesus' priority here, and it should be for us too. I sure appreciate your studying with us today. This is Mark study number 8. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.